Good morning again, Valley View. It's good to have you with us here in our series entitled Roll Calls. And I know that you made a conscious decision to be here today, and I know God will honor that decision to be here. And I'm excited about today because my brother John is going to be preaching to you from the book of Ephesians as the Apostle Paul challenges us with the role of family in our life. Here on Mother's Day, this is a special day. And I know last week Josiah, he challenged us with the idea of being a leader, thinking through not just the rise of a leader, but how to be a leader who raises others. And so today I want to ask that you give my brother John a very warm Valley View welcome as well, and welcome him to our stage today.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. This past summer, I had the privilege of preaching at my 200th wedding. And anytime you preside over that many wedding ceremonies, you see pretty much everything. I've seen people trip and fall coming down the aisle. I've had bridesmaids and groomsmen pass out in the middle of the ceremony. I've seen, family members get sick, you name it. But this past summer, I saw something that I'd never seen except in a movie, and that was at the rehearsal dinner. Night before the wedding ceremony, the father of the bride hooked his future son-in-law up to a lie detector test. And police came in and they set it all up, and I thought, I was taking notes. I've got a daughter who's a senior in high school, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do this someday. This is great. But I've also seen, a lot of other things go wrong. I did a wedding on a beach one time, and the bride had cold feet, and I just never watched anyone get that nervous before, but she just had anxiety about getting up in front of people. Her dad is a physician, and so I don't know what he gave her. He just held out 2 pills, and she took them, and halfway through the ceremony, she was not there. Her groom is going through the vows, making these lifelong promises to her, and I kid you not, she reaches up and does this while he's talking, like in his mouth, and I was just like, in charge of this 3-ring circus. So I think we would all agree it's one thing to have a bad wedding ceremony. What no one wants is a bad marriage. If I handed you, let's say, this bag of Legos, but I didn't give you the box, I didn't give you the instructions, I didn't show you a picture of what all these pieces were supposed to construct. More than likely, with the help of some friends, you could piece something together, build something, but probably not what it was intended to be. Unfortunately, a lot of us have been set up for relationship failure because we've been handed the pieces for relationships. Like, we know in our hearts that we want to love someone and we want to be loved in return, but we just didn't start out with the blueprint. We didn't start out with God's big plan, God's big picture from the beginning, and that makes it a challenge. So I want to start with the picture that God had, and I want you to see what it can look like. I was reading this past week about a couple that's been married for 55 years. And I think in all of us, there's a desire to have any kind of relationship that gets to that point. But their great-grandchildren really wanted to have a daily video chat with them. And so they bought them this computer, and being older people, they were a little bit challenged technologically. And so they're setting up their web camera to have this chat with their great-grandkids. And unbeknownst to them, it's recording everything they're doing. Take a look at this.
No, look at the monkey.
Did it capture? Why did it didn't say? I put it on capture.
That's a pretty good monkey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wait a minute.
I don't think you
here,
can.
now, do it again. What does it say here? Take a photo snapshot. Okay.
Hello, my darling. Hello, my baby. Hello, my god dog. Let out the good job. Let out go say hi. No alcadeza. Hold up, I got the job to do tappy. Love out to do tappy.
Word. Shoot. It said.
I'm so sad, Esther. I'm so sad. Look at that. All the wrinkles up there and the cracks in my head. I can do Mrs. Doubtfire, couldn't I? Oh, it's perfectly all right.
Take a series of photos. I was doing
That's
that.
okay.
And you can email these to selected media, but why want to take a picture? Take photo.
Oh, no, dear. Pardon me.
I did it before by accident.
You're like me. You do more things by accident than most people do on purpose.
Display. See, this is the one I took by mistake.
How'd you do that?
I don't know. I'm trying to do it for you.
See how pretty your hair is? Did you notice that?
No.
How pretty your hair is.
I don't know where you are, honey.
Just drop your dress a little bit.
So I love that video for a lot of different reasons, but primarily because that's what we all want. They're so comfortable with one another, so at ease with one another, and ultimately that's what God wants for us. It's interesting, in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus asked a question about marriage. A question that a lot of people had in that day is still relevant for us today, and here was Jesus' response. He said, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate." So God's plan for marriage was very clear from the beginning. His plan was one man plus one woman for one life. I read about a man this past week who fell in love with a coworker, but she wasn't reciprocating. She wasn't in love with him. And so he thought the way to win her affection was by writing her an old-fashioned letter every day. So he'd write her a letter telling her why he thought she was beautiful or why she was good at something, and he would address the envelope, put a stamp on it, put it in the mailbox. True story, after 2 years of doing this, 740 letters he wrote to her. She married the mailman who delivered all those letters to her. They fell in love with one another. Isn't that the way it works, though? Would you agree with this thought that it's easier to fall in love than it is to stay in love? One friend of mine said it this way: to fall in love requires a pulse. To stay in love requires a plan. And God's plan from the beginning was that one man and one woman fall in love with one another and stay in love for the rest of their lives. Man, that's easier said than done. In Australia, they now have what they call 7-year trial marriages, where at the end of 7 years, if you don't like the person that you've said yes to, you can walk away without any legal ramifications involved. Breaks my heart. At 71 years of age, this man's name is Lawrence Ripple. He robbed a bank in Kansas City recently, and after robbing it, sat down in the lobby and told the teller that he didn't want to go anywhere, didn't want to go home for sure. And when the police came, he said, "I'd rather go to jail than spend another day with my wife." I love this. The best part of the story, the judge sentenced him to 6 months of house arrest. Again, easier to fall in love than it is to stay in love. See, God not only had a plan, God also had a purpose for relationships. And so there's one plan, but there's two purposes. Purpose number one for any dating relationship or marriage relationship is to reflect God's image. You understand this, but it's worth repeating. Both men and women bear the image of their Creator, but in different ways. Together, we become a more complete picture of the image of God than we do apart from one another. So students, if you're dating someone and thinking about taking it to the next step of getting engaged or eventually marrying that person, you need to be asking yourself bigger questions than, can this person provide for me financially? Will this person make me happy? Do we look good together on Instagram? You need to be asking yourself questions like this: will this person help me reflect the image of God to a world that is confused about who God is? Will the watching world see God more clearly because the two of us have decided to become one flesh? See, sadly, what happens when two people get married who aren't confident in who God has made them to be and saved them to be, they end up putting pressure on one another to fit into molds they were never designed to fit into. And that can be utterly exhausting. So if you get married for another reason other than reflecting the image of God, can I challenge you? Start discussing today the characteristic of God that you see in your boyfriend or your girlfriend, in your husband or your wife. And then decide from this day forward that you're going to highlight those characteristics, those God-like characteristics, and you're going to grow those so that as a couple, you become the clearest picture of God that you can be to the watching world. Purpose number one, reflect the image of God. Purpose number two in any relationship is reflect God's love. Now, you also know that God loves his bride, the church, with an unconditional, never-ending love. And the world should be able to look at your relationship with a member of the opposite sex and gain a better understanding of God's love for the church. Jesus drew a line in the sand one time and he told the crowd, "A new command I give you." And man, everyone leaned in because like all of our talk shows, everyone's looking for that next best piece of advice. And then Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another." And you could almost see it on the crowd's face, like, what? That's it, Jesus? You should have studied harder. That can't be the end of the statement. But Jesus understood something that I think we need to hear. He moved love from just being about attraction to being all about action. Our world has drawn more to romantic love than reflective love. And we're surrounded every day by examples of people who have jumped into marriage relationships for romantic purposes only. And that'll never sustain you. Brad Pitt recently said in an interview, marriage is overrated. Marriage is nothing more than a piece of paper. Now, I would expect someone who's cheated on one wife to get another wife to say something like that. One of the women who's on that TV show, The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, released a book on marriage recently. And in it, she espoused her wisdom, and she said this: if you cheat on your spouse, don't tell your spouse. Everyone gets one free pass. That's the relationship advice we're getting today. So let me ask you this question. Would you agree with this? The world doesn't need more experts. The world needs more examples. We need more people who understand that the plan of marriage is simply one man plus one woman for one life. End of question. End of statement. And the purpose of that relationship is twofold: to reflect the image of the person who designed marriage and to reflect his love for his bride, the church. Now, how do we do that? That's where really the rubber meets the road. How do we accomplish those ends? Well, God then builds on the one plan and two purposes by giving us three principles, and he repeats these principles throughout the New Testament over and over again so that we don't miss it. Principle number one for a healthy relationship is submit to one another. Submit to one another. Now, friends, we live in a culture, unfortunately, that sees submission as an act of weakness. You ever had to submit to a coach? You ever had to submit to a boss? That's not a moment of weakness. It actually takes great strength to do that. That's why Paul said, submit to one another out of respect for Jesus. It's an act of worship. And the Greek word Paul used there is hupotasso. Literally means to come under someone else's authority. It's living with a you first, me second mindset. In a letter to the Philippian church, Paul said it this way: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider other people better than yourselves. That is hupotasso. That is you first, me second. And it's the polar opposite of everything our culture is promoting. Our culture is promoting a me first and you second mindset. But how's that working? Literally, how is that working? Well, what it does is it takes two people and it divides them. It doesn't unite them. When we submit ourselves to one another, we actually are able to unite with another person in a beautiful way. Because hupotasso allows us to complement each other instead of competing against one another. My wife Allison and I decided early on in our marriage relationship that she would handle all the financial decisions because that's a strength of hers. And we decided that I would handle all the relational conflict decisions in our parenting because that's a strength of mine. Now, I weigh in on financial decisions and she weighs in on relationship conflict decisions. But early on we decided, man, let's not compete against one another's strengths. Let's complement each other so that we can be a picture of oneness. Dr. John Gotham from the University of Washington has spent the last 20 years of his life doing research on what makes a marriage flourish and what makes a marriage flounder. He says it all comes down to a very evidence-based scientific ratio between negative and positive interactions. He calls it the 5-to-1 ratio. And he says, and he can back it up, if a couple has 5 negative interactions for every 1 positive interaction, over time, that marriage will fall apart. Now, on the flip side, if a married couple has 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction, interestingly, that marriage will flourish. And he defines negative interactions in very specific terms as anything from a frown to a roll of the eyes, to a sigh, to complaining, yelling, putting the other person down, to the silent treatment. He defines a positive interaction as anything from a compliment to laughter, to handwritten notes, to holding hands, to hugs. And he says sometimes what can turn an unhealthy relationship into a healthy relationship is challenging the couple to flip the ratio. So do that this week. Do 5 nice things every day for one another and just see what happens. And this man's name is Glenn Wolfe. And unfortunately, he holds the Guinness Book of World Record for the most marriages in our country. He's been married 29 times. Now you hear that number and you think, who in their right mind would marry someone who's been married that many times? I mean, surely wife number 17 or wife number 18 or 19 would have thought, the 5-to-1 ratio with Glenn is probably not going to be very good. I don't think you'll be surprised to hear this. When he died recently, no one, wives, kids, grandkids, came to claim his body for burial. No funeral for Glenn. Sadly, I read about another man whose wife divorced him on Valentine's Day. He had been a jerk over the years, and she'd finally had enough. She'd hit her threshold, and she walked out on him, planned it intentionally on the most romantic day of the year, said, I'm done, no more. In response to that, this man, every Valentine's Day, now goes to the theater in his hometown and buys every other seat in all of the theaters to all the movies. So couples on Valentine's Day can't sit next to one another. This kind of stuff is real. And some of you know people like this. You talk about spite. You talk about bitterness. Man, my dad used to say the last 5 letters in the word jealousy are there for a reason. Being jealous is a lousy way to live. Being mean, being angry, being unforgiving, it's just not a good way to live. This is Elmira and Herbert Fisher. They're now my heroes in life because they broke the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest marriage in our country's history. They were married 87 years. 87 years. Herbert died when he was 105 years of age, and 2 years later, Elmira also died at 105 years of age. In an interview before their passing, they were asked to give some practical advice to young couples. And friends, the wisdom they shared was a gold mine. Get online and research them. But one of the things that stood out to me was in their very first year of marriage, they bought 2 rocking chairs and set them on their porch. And every night, after dinner was done and the dishes were put away and the kids were put to bed, they'd go out there and they might have a 5-minute conversation. They might have an hour-long conversation, but they talked. And they looked each other in the eyes and they valued one another for 87 years. And Elmira said this, marriage is not a contest. Never keep score. God has put the 2 of you together on the same team to win. What's she saying? She's saying hupotasso. You first, me second. Submit to one another. Priority number 2, the Bible's very clear on this one, serve one another. Serve one another. Now, fortunately for us, the Bible's filled with great examples of people who would do anything for their significant other. Ruth, as you know, lost everything, and Boaz graciously, generously brought her into his home so that he could provide whatever she needed. How about Hannah and Elkanah? You remember them? They didn't have children early in their marriage relationship. They battled infertility, but they didn't give up on one another, and they definitely didn't give up on God. They continued to plead with God, please, we just want to have kids. Jacob and Rachel had the worst dating experience in the history of mankind. I don't care what you say. No one went through what Jacob and Rachel went through. And yet, in spite of that bad dating relationship, Genesis 29:20 says, so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. And an often overlooked example that we should look to today is Solomon. Here's a young man who in his younger years, he chased as many women as he could. He slept with as many women as he possibly could. But you remember at the end of his life, he finally found someone to settle down with. And he wrote a book about it. It's called Song of Songs. And we have a front row seat to their dating relationship, their marriage relationship when they first have kids, their early years of marriage, and then their latter years of marriage. And towards the end of the book, Solomon looks at his older wife and he says to her, your hair is like a flock of goats descending from Gilead. Now, if you're a young man in here, don't take notes on that, okay? You don't want to say that like on your first date, probably won't lead to your second date. But I don't want you to miss the beauty of what's transpiring here. He's looking at her and he's not talking about, oh, your hair's gray, I think you need to color it. Doesn't say that to her. No, he looks at her and he says, your hair is wavy and it's still beautiful to me. And then he moves down from her hair to her mouth and he says, your teeth are like a flock of sheep coming up from washing. Each has its twin. Not one of them is alone. So not only are her teeth white, but she has all of them, okay? Which, I'm from Kentucky. That's a big deal, all right? And I want you to notice what he doesn't say to her. He doesn't point out the wrinkles around her mouth. He doesn't point out the fact that her skin is sagging around her neck. He says her smile is beautiful to him. And I want you to notice she's smiling from the first compliment. So he says something about her hair. She opens her mouth because she's grinning. It meant the world to her. And then he continues to move further and further down her body. I'll spare you the explicit comments he makes. But notice she's naked. I want you to notice this. She's naked and she's unashamed in the presence of her husband. And then he says to her, your navel, midsection, is rounded goblet that never lacks blended wine. Your waist is a mound of wheat encircled by lilies. She's put on some weight over the years. And he loves it because that belly, that stomach that he's looking at has birthed children. It's brought new life into this world and joy into his. And he compares it to fine wine and beautiful flowers. And he's saying, bring it all on. And friends, she is flattered by his love and she feels secure in his love. And she says to him, I am my beloved's and he is mine. And his banner over me is love. She feels safe in his presence. Beautiful picture. You know, years ago, Gary Chapman wrote a great book called The 5 Love Languages. If you haven't read it, you should. And in it, he says every person has a primary way that they receive love and give love. And he listed those 5 most common ways in these categories. He says there's gift giving, there's words of affirmation, there's quality time, acts of service, physical touch. For my wife, Allison, it's definitely quality time. She wants to make sure that we have time each week together. For me, it's acts of service. And whether you're dating or married, you should know how the person you love gives and receives love so that you can do for them what you would want them to do for you. I read this past week about a husband who writes a note a day to his wife because her love language is words of affirmation. And friends, she's kept all the notes he's ever written in a little box, 10,000 of them total. Like Jesus, he's not just saying, I love my wife. He's showing her that he loves her. Submit to one another. Serve one another. And finally, priority number 3, biggest one, sacrifice for one another. I've noticed in counseling that couples start fighting with one another when they stop sacrificing for one another. And a very respected marriage therapist says the biggest challenge in most marriages is not that men and women just have different personalities, it's that we have different genders. It's really a gender issue. Men don't always understand women. Women don't always understand men. And so what he'll do in a therapy session is he'll give the couple a journal. And he'll say, over the next 2 weeks, I want you to write down everything you're thinking and feeling. And then in our next therapy session, we're going to read the journals to one another. Let me give you an example of what this looks like and sounds like. One wife wrote this: tonight my husband was acting weird. We had made plans to meet at a nice restaurant for dinner. Conversation wasn't flowing. So I suggested we go somewhere quiet so we could talk. He agreed, but he didn't say much. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. I asked him if it was my fault that he was upset. He said he wasn't upset, that it had nothing to do with me and not to worry about it. On the way home, I told him that I loved him. He smiled and kept driving. When we got home, he just sat there quietly and watched TV, continued to seem distant and absent. Finally, with silence all around us, I decided to go to bed. About 15 minutes later, he came to bed. But I still felt that he was distracted and his thoughts were somewhere else. He fell asleep. I don't know what to do. That same day, the husband wrote in his journal, rough day, boat wouldn't start, can't figure out why. That was it. There's the difference right there, okay? She's thinking she's done something. He's like, man, my boat. It's got to be the carburetor, maybe a spark plug, I don't know. And that's gender, okay? That's not personality. That's just the difference between men and women. God made us that way. You know, the book of Proverbs is full of wisdom. Proverbs 27:15 says, a nagging wife is like a dripping faucet. Nag, 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 drip, drip, drip. But the Bible also speaks about bad husbands when it says, better to live with hemorrhoids than to live with a jerk. That's not in the Bible, but it's true, okay? It's just true. The Bible does say this. Watch what God does. You want to know how to have good relationships? Imitate God. Watch what God does, and then you do it. Like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. Mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him. Learn a life of love. Observe how Jesus loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. You know, if your dating relationship or marriage relationship is in trouble, if it's on the rocks, it's probably because one of you or both of you isn't sacrificing, isn't giving up enough for the other person. So can I encourage you today to set up an appointment with someone on staff or seek an elder in the church and say, will you pray for our marriage relationship? Will you consult us on our dating relationship? Or if you need to, go to a counselor. I mean, other than your pride, what do you have to lose? I set aside a little bit of money every year to see a counselor, and I've done that for the last 15 years. One of the best practices in my life is to have another person point out some areas of weakness in my life where I can grow, where I can get better at being a husband and a dad. Best use of money I spend every single year. What's at stake? Well, let me give you an example. Dr. Les Parrott said this: for every percentage point the divorce rate drops, the lives of more than 1 million children are positively impacted. You can't go back and change the divorce you've already been through, but you can divorce-proof your next marriage. And kids, if you've been in a home where there's been a divorce, you can't go back and undo what mom and dad did, but you can decide in your heart today that things are going to be different when you get married, and they can be with God's blessing. That's definitely been true in my life and in my family, and that statistic is definitely true. Let me tell you how. My grandma spent the majority of her 20s and 30s living on what I would call an emotional tank that was empty. After a failed marriage and a few tragedies in her own life, she felt like God could never love her, that God could never forgive her for what she had been through and done in her life. She told me one time that she felt like she was wearing a big scarlet letter every time she stepped foot in church. But one Sunday, a friend invited her and her third husband to hear a new preacher who'd moved to town. And the preacher preached on grace that Sunday and even invited my grandmother to come back for the evening service. My grandparents thanked the preacher for the invitation, but quickly let him know that they weren't church-going people. But for some reason, my grandma decided to get out their best clothes that afternoon and iron them just in case they changed their minds and decided to go back. My grandparents didn't have what we call church clothes. All they owned were dancing clothes. Every weekend, they went to local halls and bars to dance with friends. So that Sunday afternoon, she ironed her dress and polished her dancing shoes. And about the time she finished, wouldn't you know it, my grandpa walked in and said, what do you say we go back to that church night and hear that preacher again? Hearing her husband say that, a man who never showed any interest in church or God, my grandma knew God was nudging them. The preacher preached on forgiveness that evening, and my grandma said it was like he was reading my mail. Instead of going forward that evening to receive Christ, they got in their car and drove down the street to a local diner to eat dinner. Halfway through their meal, my grandpa looked at my grandma with tears in his eyes and said, what do you say we go down to the river and watch some of those people get baptized? My grandma smiled and cried at the same time. As they approached the banks of the river to surrender their lives to Jesus, a leader in the church told my grandparents that they might want to change out of their nice clothes because the river was muddy. My grandma told that man, I can't think of a better way to start my new life with Jesus than by dancing into that river and dancing right out of it. And that's what she did. Please hear this. My grandmother was a cycle breaker, and I'm a third-generation Christian raising fourth-generation children who now love Jesus because of a decision she made to put it all behind her. Whatever your family history has been, whatever your family tree has looked like, you can make a decision today that you're going to be a person that honors God with your life, and you can set up future generations to do the same. One plan. It's one man plus one woman for one life. Two purposes: to reflect God's image, to reflect God's love. Three priorities: to submit to one another, to serve one another, and to sacrifice for one another the way Jesus has done for us. If we do that, I promise you, this church will not only be different, this community will be different as well. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for designing us to not live in isolation from one another, but to live in deep, intimate relationship with you and with others. Thank you for giving us a picture, a blueprint of what that's supposed to look like. Father, I pray today we begin to believe that your grace can be applied to all of our relationship mistakes. Every single one of us in this room have made a mess out of what you had in mind. And we've made mistakes along the way. We've been selfish, and we've been stubborn, and we've done what we want and what we think we need. And God, it's hurt other people. So I pray right now we begin to believe that your forgiveness is available to us. And that God, that forgiveness can give us the fresh start that we need. I pray people walk out of here and just draw a line in the sand and say, from this day forward, things are going to be different. They date differently. They treat their spouse differently. I pray for conversations over lunch for people to say, man, I'm sorry. I know that hurt you. I pray for people to say, you know what, I forgive you. Let's move on. I pray, God, people have the courage to sit down with a counselor, a third party, and say, how can we make this better? We're both bringing in a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. I pray, God, they're able to listen to that wisdom and that advice from a third party. God, in all things, we're just so grateful that you never give up on us, that you don't treat us as our sin deserves, and that we can walk out of here today being cycle breakers, that we can lay a new foundation for future generations. Help us to believe that and to live that out. In Christ's name we pray these things. Amen.